Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and we've been doing a series of remembering important people in the history, the modern history of the church. And today's show is about remembering Leonard Arrington. And we have with us Maven as co-host, and Greg Prince, the author of this book, which we're going to talk about a lot of the topics in it. And we're just going to hit a lot of the highlights. And if you want to know more, then buy that book. Thanks for being on the show, Greg.
You're welcome.
And then Patrick Mason is the chair. What's your full title?
Well, it's the Leonard Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture at Utah State. And I've got Greg's book behind me, but I also have Leonard's picture looking over my shoulder. So he keeps his eyes on me every day. That's
right. So if Leonard was on one shoulder, who would be on the other shoulder?
I'm not going to say.
So anyhow,
it's kind of like Leonard is, I guess, maybe making sure you stick within his spirit, maybe supervising.
Yeah, exactly. I'm actually genuinely just trying to channel him every day.
So actually, I thought maybe we would just review really quickly, Greg, what events occurred that led you to write the biography that you did for Leonard.
I'm an accidental writer. I didn't aspire to any of this. My two intended professions were dentistry and pathology, and most of my career has been in the pathology side. But I started writing because I was dissatisfied with my knowledge and the church's knowledge about priesthood. That came from 4 years as an elders quorum president. That book led to the McKay book because the mission president in DC, who got to know me while I was working on the priesthood book, asked that I help him to write the McKay biography. His aunt had been Claire Middlemiss, who was McKay's secretary for 35 years. She had intended to write the biography, but after McKay died and she had time, she didn't have good health. So she gave all her papers to her nephew, Bob Wright, 40,000 pages of the diaries that she kept for McKay for 35 years, tens of thousands of pages of scrapbooks. And he asked that I help him to write the biography. 2 years into that 10-year process, Bob was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. So he was aware enough that his wife was able to read him the manuscript before it went to the publisher, and he approved everything in it. That set me up for the Arrington biography, but I didn't realize it at the time. I was invited to give a lecture in Logan, and after the meeting, a woman came up and introduced herself. She said, "I'm Susan Arrington Madsen. Do you have time for breakfast tomorrow morning?"
And so you made time.
Oh, I made time for a 3-hour breakfast.
Yeah.
She wasn't asking at that point that I be the author. She was asking advice. This was at a time when the church was, I think, being rather rude to the Arrington family. Mm-hmm. Leonard had kept his own diary that was pretty good, particularly before he left his office as church historian. And he had written a document that gave the church permission to use the diaries 25 years after his death, but in his own hand, he had written on that, under no circumstances, even for archival purposes, is anyone in the church hierarchy or bureaucracy to look at the contents of this diary until that period has passed.
Smart.
They cheated.
Oh.
Not only
can I jump in? I just wanted to give like a quick, maybe one sentence, if there was anyone in our audience unfamiliar with Leonard Arrington. He was a historian in the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he was appointed by the church, and the way I understand it, basically kind of led like a revolution, maybe not revolution, but just really
change the direction.
Yeah, getting into some of the more controversial or lesser known aspects of the history, and my understanding was because he felt that it was he felt that the membership could handle it, and that it was better to fix these errors in the narrative, in the church's narrative, and be more upfront and honest about some things that the church was just teaching differently. And I guess the old guard, maybe in the church, among the top leadership, eventually really came to have a problem with that. And so there was a large crackdown, I guess. And then he more or less kind of became disgraced in a way, at least as far as the top leadership was concerned. And but still his legacy lives on. He did a lot of work in I think getting a lot of stuff out of the archives that I guess you guys can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but just making the history accessible. And I feel like for the most part, it had a lot of honesty and integrity, although there might have been a couple blips along the way. Is that a good summary?
I think so.
Okay.
What Susan was concerned about was that they had violated the terms of this agreement, and she wanted my advice as to what to do. We had several chats over the next few weeks, and then she said, well, would you be willing to do the biography? My brothers and I have read your McKay biography, and we think you're the person to do Dad's. So that's how I got into it.
Can I
Greg,
clarify?
how did they know how did Susan know that his diary had been read?
Yeah.
Because there was a meeting. This was at the time when Leonard's papers had been taken to Utah State University, and the church tried to ambush the process, had several of its employees go up there the day that they opened that material, which did not include at that point the diaries. And they claimed that most of it needed to go back to the church. And they claimed that very forcefully. So there were some heated meetings with church attorneys, with church general authorities, with attorneys for Utah State University and the personal attorney of the Arrington estate. And in one of those meetings, they produced a document that had photocopies of what they felt were the offensive entries in Leonard's diaries that needed to be extracted from them. Now, you think through that whole process. Number one, they had no legal right to look for another probably 15 years at that point. And number two, how in the world would you go into an archive and excise portions of a diary without the whole thing blowing up in your face? It was a mess. Ultimately, they had to back off on their claims about who owned the Arrington papers. And instead of 300 linear feet or whatever the total was, I think the university, more as a token, gave them about 4 linear inches of the material on 2 subjects that they felt were sensitive enough that they could make the case, yes, these should go back to the church. That was it.
Yeah, my understanding, and I've talked with several of the people who were involved, that they claimed that some of that material, it was proprietary because he had produced it as church historian, or that it included information or other things that he had access to only as church historian, that really was church property, not private property. Right.
Leonard was a pack rat. He kept records of everything, including all the receipts for secretaries and researchers he had paid out of non-church funds to make typescripts of these records. So it was a very clean history of where these things had come from. And the church really had no legal foundation to stand on, particularly when it became apparent that they had violated the terms by which Leonard had given them eventual access to his diaries. So that's how I got into it. I found early on what I had found early on with the McKay biography, that you can have all the documentary records you want. There's still going to be a void there because the documentary records are primarily objective And what you need to flesh out a really good biography, or a good history for that matter, is the subjective reminiscences of people who were there. So I began to do what I had done with McKay and did, I think about 150 interviews of family members, of colleagues, in some cases where the church would allow it, of church general officers, to give that third dimension to the biography. The McKay biography took 10 years. The Arrington biography took another 11 years. I had a day job, and so I could only devote the time to it that I could carve out of my non-work hours. That's not a good way to live, but I think the result was good.
We'll start the show sort of by talking about Leonard's early years, like the making of Leonard Arrington.
Yeah, Leonard grew up in Twin Falls, Idaho, which was not an LDS community. In fact, it was a very small minority LDS community. And I think that left an important imprint on Leonard because he saw the world as larger than Mormonism, whereas many in the Great Basin, particularly many in Utah, felt that that was their oyster. Utah and the church, and they didn't want to look outward, they wanted to look inward. From the time he was growing up, he was always looking outward, even though he eventually chose Mormon studies as his profession. He was able to put that in the context of the broader world. His father was a farmer. He was also a bishop, very devout LDS family. But Leonard had no taste at all for farming, even though his father was pushing all his sons to go into that profession. So at the first opportunity, when he graduated from high school, he went to college. And although he took a couple of agriculture courses, he could see this was not where he wanted to spend the rest of his life. So he eventually settled in on undergraduate studies in economics and then graduate studies later in North Carolina that led to a doctorate.
Was he going for academia, in history, or was he looking to become a professor? Or
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Yes.
one experience I think that's important is that he had his own chicken farm as a young man, and that sort of got him interested in business and economics, we'll say.
Well, it wasn't a chicken farm that he owned. It was his father's farm where he was running the chicken coop. And he was just never interested either in farming or even the economics of running a farm. He was interested in economic history, but not necessarily as it related to farming, and not as a tool that would enable him to become a successful farmer. He had no taste for that at all.
I can relate.
Yeah.
And Patrick, I noticed you nodding, and I wondered, if you've got maybe some similar experiences or no. I don't know.
Well, I did not grow up on a farm, but I have no desire to be a farmer. I admire those who do.
Yeah, understandable.
Now, a major impact on his life that was sandwiched between his undergraduate education and his eventual getting a doctorate degree was World War II. He went into the Army. He hoped to go into the Navy or the Air Force, but he missed the height requirement by about a half inch. And none of the stretch exercises he did got him that half inch. So that's where he was. He served in Italy. He was never in combat. He was assigned to a POW camp, took advantage of that situation to learn Italian. And also, as his unit moved from Africa up into Italy, he had some chances to work in economics and chances to get to know Italian history, to get to know opera, which he learned to love. And I think that really primed him for after his military service to go into academia in that field. He wrote some letters to John Widtsoe, who was an LDS apostle, and asked his advice. Not only is it viable to get into this field, and Widtsoe said yes, but how do I navigate the landmines that I'm going to find, because it was no secret, even at that point, that the church was very protective of its history, very suspicious of historians, and I think both then and even now, more suspicious and less congenial towards its own historians than towards non-LDS historians who are willing to write favorable histories of the church. There are several historians who are not LDS that I've known, and in all cases, I've been amazed at how much access the church gave to them that it wouldn't give to its own historians at the same time.
Wow. So going from there, what transpired just prior to getting his call? So he was writing books, and what got him on the church radar in the 60s to be called as a historian in the early 70s?
Well, he was writing good history. I think his very best book was his first, Great Basin Kingdom. Once he became church historian, the irony is he quit writing good history. He was still publishing, but most of it was ghostwritten. Sometimes the ghostwriter would be a co-author. Sometimes the ghostwriter would get mentioned on the title page or the preface. Sometimes not at all. But Great Basin Kingdom was...
And we should say that wasn't totally uncommon at the time. I mean, especially in institutional histories and even some rather well-known historians at the time in the mid-20th century would use a lot of graduate student labor and other things to write their own books.
Yeah.
So was Leonard he was the ghostwriter, or was he the...
No. Well, for Great Basin Kingdom, he was the sole author of it. It took years for him to take his doctoral dissertation and redo the entire thing at great pain to produce Great Basin Kingdom. But when that was published, it really became a landmark. I think of 3 books from that era, all within a few years of each other, that really caused Mormon history to go to a new level. Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, Juanita Brooks's Mountain Meadows Massacre, and Leonard's Great Basin Kingdom.
And maybe Thomas O'Day's book on the Mormons as well.
Yeah, I put that a half step back, but you could argue that one.
Yeah.
So I'm not familiar with
over a couple of Diet Cokes sometime.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that book, so I feel like I'm kind of the odd one out. Juanita Brooks, I know, and then of course Brody's. So the Great Basin Kingdom is that talking about a particular part of Utah? That's what I typically think of when I think of the Great Basin.
Yes,
that's the area I was born in, actually. So
its subtitle is something like The Economic History of the Latter-day Saints from 1850 to whenever.
Okay, so that's kind of like all of Utah.
It's really a history of, I mean, it starts in the Joseph Smith period, but it focuses mostly on the pioneers and settlement of Utah and territorial Utah. And it really is a terrific book. It focuses on economic history, which might, if you're not into that kind of thing, it might sound kind of dry. But it's actually, I think, a terrific and in many ways riveting story of actually how the pioneers settled this area. And he's able to do some things. He provides, economic interpretations of various things, whether it be the Relief Society, the Word of Wisdom, other kinds of things that other historians might focus on purely in a kind of religious or theological sense. But I think by looking at it economically, Leonard was able to show a completely different view and understand the human dimension. That's what he was really interested in. He said, I'll let other people decide, what God was doing on any given Tuesday in the 1850s. But he says he was focused on the economic history and the human dimension of this history. And it's really, I think the book holds up, as Greg said, really well, even many decades later.
Well, he was driven by data, not by dogma.
Yeah.
And I think that's where he really differentiated himself from the pack of other writers of Mormon history at the time. And he was willing to call the history as he saw it. He was not trying to be protective. And several of the economic ventures that he focuses on in that book were abject failures, and he pointed that out. And he put the blame, in many cases, right at the feet of Brigham Young, who thought, apparently, that by being an ecclesiastical officer, he somehow was the master of economics, and it didn't work out that way. Now, on the one hand, that book established him as a premier historian, and that's where I think he came to the attention of church leaders. On the other hand, because it was a very candid book, if the men who later took exception to him as church historian had ever bothered to read that book when they voted to sustain him as church historian, they may have chosen to vote differently. But generally, they didn't read books. What they read were complaints, basically, of underlings, and then they took a lot of pains to try to fix situations that didn't coincide with their worldview of the church, and that's where Leonard got caught later on. But the histories that were produced after he became church historian, I would argue, were tamer than Great Basin Kingdom. And yet they were the ones that senior church leaders took shots at and that they leveraged eventually to get him out of that job. But we're jumping ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, who were the big players at this time, like as he was coming in, the apostles that maybe whose names we would recognize or are going to be coming up through this story?
Well, what you have to understand is why there was a reorganization of the church historical department. It had been called the church historian's office for decades. In the early 1970s, not long after David O. McKay died, the de facto leader of the church became Harold B. Lee, who was senior apostle. Joseph Fielding Smith was in his mid-90s, was in failing health the entire time that he was president. And it was no secret that Lee was really calling the shots for the church. Lee had felt for years that the church bureaucracy was getting in its own way. When David O. McKay died, Harold B. Lee moved into the first presidency. Lee was the next in line for the presidency after Joseph Fielding Smith. Smith was in failing health the entire time he was church president, which was only about 3 years. And it was no secret that Lee was really running the church. He had felt for many years that the bureaucracy of the church was getting in its own way. He had a good point, because the various programs that really had become kingdoms within the church had all sprung up as grassroots initiatives that were later appropriated by the central church. Think of all the auxiliary organizations, the Relief Society, the Mutual, the Primary, the Sunday School. They all began as local initiatives. And by the time of David O. McKay's administration, they really were running the church on their own. They operated with separate budgets. They answered only to the first presidency. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles were really staff. And they had two main tasks. One was to speak in general conference. The other was to conduct stake conferences, and that was it. None of the organizations within the church bureaucracy reported directly to the 12. Lee wanted to change that, so he commissioned a company called CRESAP from the east part of the United States to come in and do a top-to-bottom assessment of the bureaucracy and make recommendations for how to modernize it. They did that, and it was comprehensive. Some of us are old enough to remember those years. One of the things they did was to discontinue most of the church publications. For instance, the Sunday School had its own magazine. The Relief Society had its own magazine. The Mutuals had their own magazine. All of those were done away with, and a single magazine spoke for the entire church. One of the recommendations of the CRESAP group was that the church historical department, which had always been run by ecclesiastical officers and untrained staff, untrained in history, that be professionalized. And it was from that recommendation that they decided to bring, for the first time, a professionally trained historian to be the church historian. That's where Leonard came in. He had established enough bona fides by then that they saw him as the choice to make. He convinced them also that he should have two assistants. One would represent a certain part of the church, and that was Jim Allen, who was a BYU professor, and the other was Davis Bitton, who was a professor of history at the University of Utah.
Did he have a
Basically, you just described the start of correlation.
Yeah.
That happened, started in the early 60s.
It started in the early 60s, but phase two was where Lee was able to enact his agenda instead of carrying out McKay's. McKay brought Lee in and put him as the chairman of correlation just to smooth out wrinkles in the bureaucracy, to eliminate overlap or contradicting priorities at times. And Lee did that, but the big target for him was he didn't like the fact that the priesthood was not running the church. The auxiliaries were.
Wow.
I was wondering if Leonard had a sense of kind of maybe the danger or controversy he was walking into in his position.
None.
Okay.
And I'd almost describe that in the 60s, correlation was like the reins of a horse. And from the 70s forward is more like blinders on the horse. You're going to do this one direction, our way.
Yeah, one non-complimentary description of it would be that correlation became the thought police.
How were the auxiliaries running the church? Or do you mean just like he didn't like that auxiliaries were running their own programs and he wanted priesthood over all of them?
Not only were they running their own programs, if you talk to people who came of age in those years, what they remember as being the church was the auxiliary organizations. That's what gave it its flavor. That's what made it alive for them. And so I think Lee correct in ascertaining that the priesthood really wasn't running the church. It was the auxiliary organizations, because that was the brand. And he didn't like that.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, like I remember ward bazaars.
Time period, like sacrament meeting attendance was pretty low, and so people's the way that we think about people participating in and identifying with the church today are with things like church attendance, going on missions, going on to the temple, things like that. That was not the way that most people participated in the church, especially in the first half of the 20th century. So
there was no covenant path. It was just a wide open prairie.
Something like that.
It seems a lot more social than in community based.
Certainly. I mean,
that was the bigger draw. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And the way that people oftentimes talk it, especially in the pioneer period, is that, building the kingdom had as much to do with digging canals as it did with going to sacrament meeting. Now that changes a little bit in the 20th century once all the canals are dug. But yeah, it's a social identity. It's a community identity. And so some of the markers of modern church participation just are not as prominent. And so that's why the auxiliaries are so important. It's for women, it's participation in the Relief Society, which was a dues paying organization. It wasn't a universal membership for all women in the church. And so people opted into the things that they cared about, that they resonated with, but their identity was still very much as a Mormon. But participation with the church was a little bit more sporadic through these auxiliaries.
That's right. And so therefore, Leonard Arrington gets called to be church historian.
Well, he gets called to be church historian having, number one, no idea of Vatican politics. And Mormon politics are just Vatican politics at a different order of magnitude, but the complexity is there as well. Number two, he consciously had avoided administrative duties during his time at Utah State University. He could have been a department chair, might have been a dean. He turned down any request for administrative post at the university. He just wanted to write history. And that was fine, except now he was thrust into a bureaucracy that was Byzantine. He was running an organization within the bureaucracy, which he'd never done before, and he was clueless about behind the scenes politicking. So he really was naive when he walked into that situation, and that did not serve him well. Ultimately, I think it was the major part of his undoing. He just was clueless as to what the politics were, and as a result, never built up the defenses against those onslaughts that came.
So in a way, he moved too fast, but he didn't know that that was not the right way to go.
Yes, and it wasn't so much moving too fast. I think it's likely that he was doomed anyway, because the essential issue.
Even if he had that admin experience, because
no, it had nothing to do with his lack of experience. It had to do with what he represented. The senior apostles, particularly Ezra Taft Benson, who became church president, and Mark Peterson, simply could not abide the idea that the writing of the sacred history was now turned over to professional historians. I think that was the underlying issue. Now, why they didn't figure that out when they voted in favor of the reorganization, who knows? My hunch is they didn't do their homework.
Do you think maybe they thought he would kowtow to their authority, that maybe he would be easier to control than he ended up being?
I don't think that they thought through that about Leonard as a personality. I think the reality was what he represented quickly became unacceptable to them. And at that point, it was just a question of time, because they had the power.
And it's important to recognize, I mean, Leonard was, Greg has mentioned this, Leonard throughout his life was a deeply loyal and faithful and devout member of the church. Here in Logan, while he was a professor at Utah State University, he was in the stake presidency. I've talked with lots of people. Just the other night, I was talking to somebody who is in his stake, and he was a beloved church leader. So he was deeply dedicated to the church, and I think he had worked things out in his own mind in terms of reconciling his faith with his profession as a historian and the pursuit of truth and data wherever it led him. But as Greg said, he just, I think, hadn't anticipated. Of course, he knew that not everybody had been on the same journey that he was, the same intellectual journey, but he just didn't anticipate the way that would play out in church politics. But he was a deeply loyal church member. And so when the church called him to be church historian, I mean, what else is there to do but to say yes?
And I actually have a friend whose brother worked for BYU in the 70s and 80s and maybe even the 90s, and is telling him that Leonard Arrington was never called as the church historian at the same way as the prior apostles that had been in. So could you clarify exactly, was he set apart to be the church historian in the very beginning?
Both of those answers are correct, but there's a paradox there. Prior to when he went in, the church historian was over whatever the department was. But with the reorganization, it had expanded duties so that there were 4 divisions. There was archives, library, church history, and then I think historical sites. And each one of those had a director. Those positions hadn't existed previously. He was called and set apart as church historian and director of the church history division. And therein was the problem, that in the past, that title had meant somebody who was over the whole franchise. Now it meant somebody who was over 1/4 of the whole franchise, and a general authority who originally was Joseph Anderson, very benign and elderly in his 90s, person who had been the secretary to the first presidency for decades, was now the ecclesiastical officer over the whole church history enterprise, those 4 divisions.
Sort of like the liaison.
He was set apart as church historian, but no, the church historian that he was not of the same magnitude as of his predecessors.
Because he still reported to general authorities.
Yes. Now, when they disbanded the history division and released him, they went several years without there being a church historian. And then in the early 2000s, Rick Turley, who was with the history department, went to the first presidency and said, you know, there is a scriptural mandate that there be a church historian and a church recorder. And that was when they decided to reinstitute the title. They called Marlon Jensen to fill those jobs. And once again, that became the overarching position over all the franchise. So Leonard was an aberration in that for that period of 10 years, he held the same title as his predecessors and his successors, but it wasn't the same job. Does that make it somewhat clearer?
Yeah, it does. So there was never an official releasing at conference. Is that true?
Correct. In fact, in 1982, he went to the first presidency and basically said, hey, was I ever released? And so they decided to give him a release 2 years retroactive.
But under the table, not at conference.
That's right. No mention of it.
Yeah.
And then just to rub salt in the wound, they had pictures of the church historians lining the wall of the church history department, and they removed his.
Wow. And so when he takes over the reins of the church history department, according to what he thought, what was his original goal to do? Did he have like one bigger job than others?
He wanted
the sesquicentennial was coming up.
Church history. He wanted to move from the devotional history that had really carried since the foundation of the church. It was polemical history, but it was polemical history on the outside as well. Modern historiography took a long time to work its way in. He felt that we didn't need to apologize for our history. We didn't need to hide the ball. So that's what he hoped to do. And he felt deep down in his soul that if he did that, then everything would work out fine. That's what the Lord needed. That's what the church needed. Now, as part of that, shortly after he went in, he led an initiative to have a multi-volume sesquicentennial history of the church written. B.H. Roberts had written the centennial history in 1930, but there had been no official in-depth church history written since that time. The closest thing to it was Joseph Fielding Smith's Essentials in Church History, which predated by 8 years the Roberts Comprehensive History and had over 20 editions. Every couple of years, they'd bring it up to date and put out a new edition. That was it. That was the state of the art in church history. It was not a good history of the church, and that's what Leonard was trying to get past. Now, in addition to the sesquicentennial history, which I think initially was envisioned as having 16 volumes, he commissioned Jim Allen and Glenn Leonard to write a 1-volume history that would really supplant Essentials in Church History and be the kind of textbook that could be used for the seminaries and institutes. It was called The Story of the Latter-day Saints. It was a very good, solid history. It didn't dig down too deeply. It didn't get into a lot of controversy. But we welcomed that book with great joy. I can remember when it came out, our study group was just elated to be able to read finally a history that wasn't apologetic. But that was the book that started to get them in trouble, not because of what was in the book. Benson and Peterson later admitted they'd never read the book. What they read were underlined passages from their lieutenants because their quest all along was not to understand the book. It was to figure out how to dissolve the franchise. And that book became the handle that they thought they could grab to get there. And eventually they were successful.
So that book came out in 1976. And I think my seminary church history was like the year before. So I knew nothing about the church's history during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the growth of the church, you know, in the 50s and 60s.
These guys were all devout church members. They didn't have an axe to grind. They were trying to produce histories that at the same time would be driven by data, but would be told in such a way as to be uplifting rather than troublesome.
That's right. I'm sorry, Patrick. Go ahead.
Well, can I read a passage? And this comes from Leonard's own writings, actually from one of his memoirs called Adventures of a Church Historian. And he talks about this period and sort of the ideas that he came into the church historian's office or the church historical department with. And right at the very beginning, they hold a service with the staff and so forth. And he said, I suggested to the staff some requisites of a good Mormon historian. Sincerely believe that religious experiences are possible, be able and willing to consider ideas and explanations, even though they may not be consistent with your values or beliefs, and have a capacity to see events and people in perspective. And I think that's exactly what Greg is talking about. So on the one hand, I mean, he's a believer, right? He believes that God does act in history, but maybe not all the time, and maybe not all the ways that we sometimes attribute to it, that you have to be able to look at complexity. You have to be able to look at data that may not agree with what you already believed or expected. And then you have to be able to put that in context. Like Greg said, he had studied American history broadly, Western history. So he didn't just know church history. He knew how to put this into broader context. But as he came into it, as he thought about what Mormon history was and the major themes of it, he said in that initial meeting, he said, there's 4 big themes: the restoration of the gospel, the proclamation of the gospel to persons around the world, or missionary work, the buildup of cooperative activity, the spirit of working together, or basically building Zion, and then conflicts with their neighbors, non-Mormon governing officials, and with the federal government, right, which has always been a theme of Mormon history. But so he came into it with ideas and with a view that you could both respect religious experience and respect the complexity of the human experience. And I think that's what he and his staff were trying to do. But as Greg said, that sometimes fell on deaf ears.
But you said the book wasn't really all that controversial. So maybe if there's this kind of this overarching sense of doom, I feel from you, Greg, just kind of like it was doomed from the start, like when he came in, kind of a thing. But is there a possibility that had they taken the book at face value, that they might have adjusted, they might have looked at it and said, hey, this is going okay, or just pause?
No, I don't think from the standpoint of the ecclesiastical officers, things were going to change. I think Leonard could have bought time if he'd had political instincts. Initially, everything was going his way. Harold B. Lee, to my surprise, as I dug into the data, was very supportive of what Leonard was doing. I thought Lee would be more of a hardliner. On issues of history, he was very encouraging to Leonard to tell the story straight. Don't try to cut corners on it. The problem was that, to everybody's surprise, Lee, who was by Mormon standards just a young guy when he became church president in his mid-70s, only lived a year and a half, and then unexpectedly and very rapidly died.
Now, was Lee a descendant of John D. Lee?
No.
Okay. Because I
No.
thought maybe if he was, that he would know more about church history from family lore.
No, and Lee was not only very supportive of Leonard's franchise, nobody would challenge Lee's authority. Spencer Kimball, not so much. Now, Kimball was on one level supportive of what Leonard was doing. He thanked him for several things, one being the biography of Edwin Woolley, Spencer Woolley Kimball.
Right.
But as Kimball's administration progressed, his attention was really focused on the worldwide church more than anything else. And he didn't have the bandwidth to pay much attention to what was going on in the historical department. And then as his health began to deteriorate, that was the opening.
And I think one thing that Maven's question is sort of missing is that even though they produced that one book in 1976 that had more history in it than prior books, they were working on a bigger project that was to come out a few years later.
Encyclopedic almost.
And different people were working on different chapters, I think, that Greg talked about.
Well, no, it was the sesquicentennial history is going to be 16 volumes, and each volume would have
different people working on different volumes.
No,
right?
It was not a single volume thing. The current comprehensive history, Saints, was envisioned much, much later after Leonard died.
And so were the leaders getting advanced information about what was starting to be written in those volumes, and that's started to give them cold feet about the whole project?
Well, one move that Leonard made that did come back to haunt him was that he, in accepting the position, demanded that the work from the historical department not go through correlation, because he knew what correlation would do to it. And that, I think, just added to the angst of the senior apostles that they couldn't use the correlation apparatus to strip these histories of things they found to be offensive. So they really didn't have advance approval privileges for these, for the chapters, for articles, for books. And that became part of the problem.
And so,
I don't think that changing any of those factors would in the long run have given a different outcome. I think you had the clash of two ideologies that simply were not compatible with each other. On the one hand, the traditionalist who felt that it was the ecclesiastical arm of the church that should write the ecclesiastical history. On the other hand, the professionals who were just going by the norms of modern historiography. If anything, they were pulling some punches compared to other histories in other venues, because they were trying to be protective of the church without violating their professional norms.
Yeah, church leaders like Ezra Taft Benson, Marky Peterson, later Boyd K. Packer, that one of their complaints was that these histories had taken God out of the equation, that they ascribed too much to human agency rather than divine workings, that they tried to explain everything through material conditions. Now, again, that's, as Greg said, that's what we do as historians, because our methods don't give us access to the supernatural and to what God is doing. Those are theological questions. And so it's really a kind of disciplinary or methodological divide. But there were Benson and others gave multiple public addresses, let alone all the things that were happening in private, where they, and it wasn't just about church history. Remember that 1976 was also the bicentennial. And they complained about broader secular histories are being written, not just by church historians, but more broadly by American historians, that they thought had taken God out of the story, right? The miracle that had happened at the time of the revolution and everything. And so they wanted God to be at the center of the story. And for professional historians, just can't do that. That's not what our discipline and methodology allows for. So it really was a clash without a whole lot of communication and bridge building between the two to try to understand each other's worldview.
Right. There was another major movement afoot that was deeply threatening to the church, and that was the Equal Rights Amendment. When you pull up the drawbridge, you halt all traffic. But they were pulling up the drawbridge to try to defend against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And there was a lot of collateral damage as a result of that.
On top of work sort of against the civil rights movement just the decade prior.
Yeah, that was nothing new.
Right. And so Leonard was growing the department, right? If he's going to write this big,
he was growing it, but there was another issue that he felt very strongly about, and that was Mormon history had been totally insular. And he felt that the Mormon story was a story that had relevance beyond the Zion curtain.
Richer and more complex and in a way more exciting.
Yes. So after he became church historian, I feel that his greatest contributions were not in the writing of history, because that was all dished off to surrogates. It was that he made great strides in making Mormon history both accessible to and compelling to the non-Mormon readers, particularly in academia.
And he might have thought that increasing interest might even lead to more converts at some point.
Might, but at least it would give respectability, whereas before we had misunderstanding that often led to persecution. And right. He made great strides in that within the larger historical community. He became a very respectful figure. He was the go-to guy, certainly, for Mormon history, but Mormon history itself achieved a level of credibility that it never had before. And largely, it was not just Leonard, because other people were writing better histories, but he became the primary ambassador.
But lots of famous people, lots of famous people came from his staff. From that.
Well, that was the second thing, that in addition to being the ambassador to changing Mormon history from inward looking to outward looking, he became mentor-in-chief. And not only training new historians, but training a subset that nobody had really paid attention to in the past, that he called history buffs, people who did not have formal training in historiography, who got interested in the subject, and in some cases wrote some of the most important histories we've had. I think of Linda Newell and Val Avery writing Mormon Enigma, the biography of Emma Smith.
Well, and I think that puts a point, even that, I mean, he cultivated a new generation, really the first generation, or among the first generation of female LDS historians. Now, we did have Juanita Brooks beforehand. We had Fawn Brody and others, but he was intentional about hiring and training, and in some ways protecting women who were on his staff and others, to allow them to write histories. That was really important. And I think to your first point, Greg, about broadening the base of those who studied and cared about Mormon history, I think one of his great legacies was his role in founding the Mormon History Association, again, which is totally outside the church. Its independence is one of its strengths. That's always been, it's been complicated. There's been ups and downs, but it's always been an independent organization, not under church purview or church control. And it's always been welcoming to anybody who is interested in the Mormon past. So obviously the majority of people who participate are Latter-day Saints, but there are a lot of non-Latter-day Saints. He was also one of the first places where people in the Reorganized Church, now Community of Christ, could engage. So this was so the Mormon History Association, as an offshoot of the Pacific branch of the American Historical Association, it became really one of the great, if not the most important vehicles for the professionalization of the field outside of the church history department itself.
So let's see. Let's start talking about the undoing of the church historian's office, or whatever.
Well, we've been talking about that already.
Interlaced, right?
It was death by the inch.
I know that
So was there a I guess like a final straw then, or kind of a death knell, something that just really...
Sure. It was when he was effectively released, even though they didn't announce it publicly, and sent packing. They gave him a vinegar sop by making him the director of a new institute at BYU, the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute. He had an endowed chair there. It was the Charles Redd Chair of Western History.
I feel like we're missing a big part of the story, or the drama and the tea, maybe. I don't know. Patrick, what do you...
Preceding that was the dissolution of the Sesquicentennial History Project. And that really broke his heart, as well as that of a lot of the authors. It had been the driving goal for them for several years, and then they were told, no, we're not interested anymore.
Is there a date on that dissolution?
Pardon?
Is there a date on that? Was that like 1979 or 80?
Ish, yeah. Well, it was certainly before 1980, because that's
Right.
when it was supposed to be published.
Right.
So
April 6th of 1980 would have been the Sesquicentennial.
When the storm clouds started to gather on that one. Some of the authors decided to go ahead and publish on their own. The church released them from their contracts with Deseret Book. That's where Richard Bushman's Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism came from. I think there were probably 6 or 8 of those that eventually were published. Patrick, you may have better numbers on that.
Yeah, but yes, that's about right. Some of them are really important. So you mentioned Bushman's book. Thomas Alexander's book called Mormonism in Transition came out of that, and that's one of the most important books in Mormon history. So fortunately, yeah, we did get the products of some of that. We just didn't get the whole comprehensive series.
Yeah, the Kirtland one was published.
Was Britches, I think, international history?
I think so, because there were 2 or 3 of those volumes that were supposed to look at the international church.
Yeah.
One at the Pacific Asian Church, one at the European. I think one of the Latin American. Wasn't that Tullis?
Yeah, I think that might be. Yeah.
I don't think that one was ever published.
Yeah.
Which would have been really fitting with Spencer Kimball's growth of the church. I remember seeing the arrows where missionaries from America would go to the different countries and regions of the world, and then those regions would produce missionaries in their local regions. And so that would, knowing the history behind the growth of the church internationally would be sort of part of Spencer Kimball's legacy.
Yeah, but back to Maven's statement, the straw that really broke the whole franchise was his being released and them dissolving the history division. People were either let go or they found other places on their own. Davis went back to University of Utah. Jim Leonard went back to BYU. But
why didn't they
not
go
all
back
of
to having, an apostle or, a priesthood holder doing it like they did before?
Repeat the question.
Because so they had a different system before, right? They had
like why didn't they just release him and call a new apostle? That's what Maven's saying, right?
Yeah,
that's a good question. Eventually, they kind of did that when they recombined everything and put that under a new church historian. They had a general authority over it. It was Joseph Anderson first, and then there were
Howard Hunter served in that role for a while.
Hunter was before. Hunter was
right.
immediately after Joseph Fielding became president, and he didn't want the job. And I think he accelerated the process of getting a professional historian in. Homer Durham was the general authority over.
You have to throw that G in there.
And
G
he
Homer
oversaw
Durham.
the dismantling of the whole thing.
Right. And
Yeah,
so
but it's a good question, Maven, as to why there was that gap. I don't have clarity on why, whether it was an active decision not to have a church historian or just not a priority.
Yeah.
And what was the year that he moved to, his office was moved to BYU?
It was a gradual process before they locked the door. It was done by 1982.
Right. And that corresponds with Boyd K. Packer talking about how some people value history too much. They worship history too much.
Yeah. Packer was a junior apostle when this all began, but he became more and more influential in the battle. So it was really Benson, Peterson, Packer that drove the franchise over the cliff.
That's right.
And I don't think they were really looking ahead, Maven, to get back to your question. I think they just were intent on dissolving what was there and not paying much attention to, so what's next?
Got it.
So what's the position he takes at BYU?
Well, he's the director of the new Joseph Fielding Institute of Church History, which was created as a landing pad for Leonard and those who wanted to go down there.
And
I don't think that institute ever really produced that much.
At what point did people start saying it was new Mormon history and that it was the Camelot days?
Oh, that was, well, those are two separate issues.
Things, right?
They were using the term New Mormon History in the glory days, so in the early to mid 70s.
And what would you say that is? How would you define that to somebody, what that meant?
What it meant was the movement from devotion-based history to data-based history. So it wasn't new in the context of historiography across the board. It was just new to the discipline of Mormon history because it had been under the shackles of the ecclesiastical leaders for so long.
Data over dogma.
Yep. Now the nomenclature of Camelot, I think it was Davis Bitton who coined that, but as was the case with the Kennedy administration, it was a retroactive term. They weren't calling either one Camelot while it was happening.
Contemporaneously, that's right. You don't know what's happening sometimes when it's when you're right in it.
Yeah, it was driven by the nostalgia of the past rather than the reality of the present.
So I had a listener, when I mentioned that I was going to do this show, talked about how was the new Mormon history somehow a disservice to Mormonism, or were there different people that took it in different ways?
Well, let me answer that a little bit indirectly. When the church finally got around to publishing its church history essays, which began in late 2013, I was at a banquet sitting next to Steve Snow, who at that time was the church historian. And he said, you'll be interested to know that next week we're presenting the first 2 of those essays to the 12, and we think they'll be approved so that they can be posted on the church website.
Wow.
Now, that was a process that had begun more than a half dozen years earlier with Marlon Jensen, but it kept getting stonewalled within the Quorum of the 12. So I said, that's great, Steve. Now, how are you going to deploy them? And he paused and he says, yeah, tell me. Because he realized, and this gets to your question, the same response that answers the questions of one group will unsettle another group. How do you address both of them? And the answer is, we still don't know. Much of our dilemma is of our own causing, because we have shielded so many people for so long that when the wraps start to come off, they easily become unhinged, because we had told them this for so long and now we're telling them that, and that they suddenly lose their moorings.
Plus, it seems
And
like it all
also,
kind of gathers together, so you've got kind of like an avalanche effect. So it's like all at once. It seems to me, and I'm wondering again. I'm the one that's the least knowledgeable here. I'm wondering once. I'm thinking of like the kind of the rubber band analogy, like you're stretching it. Things are getting moved, but then when one side is let go and it kind of snaps back to where it was. Would you say is that what kind of happened to the church history department after Leonard Arrington's work was undone, or did he actually kind of succeed in moving the bar even just a little tiny bit, or did it just completely go back the other way and then it was just kind of a fight to like eventually get it back over again? And
that's out of the bag.
Yeah.
I will give you an analogy that I think works pretty well. The foundation for the Salt Lake Temple was initiated in 1853. And they dug the hole, they put in the bedrock for it. And then the Utah War happened. And Brigham Young ordered that they disguise the entire site. The walls hadn't started to come up yet because he didn't want the Union troops to desecrate it. And it sat there for quite a while, for about a decade, I think. After that, then they uncovered it and proceeded to build the temple there. I think that's what happened with Leonard, that he and his franchise laid a very good foundation, and that foundation got covered up for years. But ironically, when the Joseph Smith Papers project kicked into high gear, they responded by bringing up the people they had shipped out to the Joseph Fielding Institute, and they were some of the most important figures in writing the Joseph Smith Papers.
That's a great analogy.
That is really, really perfect. I just had to say.
And I think that Leonard, wherever he's watching from, probably has taken great satisfaction in being able to say, wow, that's a magnificent building, and we laid the foundation.
Yeah, it wasn't
And
lost.
I think that the fruits of, let's say, the disguising of the historians' temple foundations is the resulting make Joseph Smith monogamous again movement that's we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and this is, I think, in the mainstream of what's happening nationally. If you don't like the facts, then create alternative facts, which is a horrible, horrible way to go. And there's going to be a huge price to be paid for years and years because we are thinking, gee, we can just write our own version and call it truth. It's not the way it works. And you can't keep doing that indefinitely because you're building a house of cards and eventually it'll tumble. You have to be grounded in truth. There was a fascinating lecture last night I watched online. It was from the National Cathedral, which is just a few minutes from where we live. But the speaker was Francis Collins, who was the director of National Institutes of Health and the director of the Human Genome Project. Very devout religious man who came to religion in his 20s. But his whole thrust was, we have to get back to valuing truth, to valuing loyalty, to valuing science, because if you ignore those, then you're going down to a road that's going to have a very unhappy ending for you.
Yeah, let me read another quote from Leonard here. This is more retrospective, and he's talking about himself and Davis Bitton, one of his lieutenants that Greg had mentioned. We felt no conflict between maintaining our faith and writing historical truth. The Lord, we pointed out, doesn't require us to believe anything that is untrue. Our faith had changed and deepened, had become richer and more consistent with the complexities of human experience. Having made a long study of the facts of Mormon history, we still had strong testimonies of the gospel. So for Leonard, it was always both and. It wasn't faith or history, it was faith and history. And And I love that line, and this absolutely reinforces what Greg is saying. He says that God doesn't require us to believe anything that's untrue.
Well,
and so his pursuit of truth was, I think, an expression of his Mormon values, not a betrayal of them.
He said it a little more forcefully in private. One of the people I interviewed was George Smith, who was the founder of Signature Books. And George said, I was in a small setting with him one time, and he said, God doesn't need our lies.
Yeah, that's even better.
Yeah, if God is all powerful, and the gospel is true, it should be able to withstand whatever comes to it, right?
And I would say briefly, I think one of the challenges that Leonard had, and the challenges that are still with us, that Greg alluded to, is the department is the church history department. It's tasked with researching and publishing about the church's history. It's not the church theology department. That's outside its purview. But all of these new facts, this data that Leonard and the other historians uncovered then and still continue to do so, they are operating within an older theological understanding of what the church is and the way that God works in the world. And Jesus told us what happens when you pour new wine into old bottles. And so what hasn't happened, because there isn't a church theology department, and the church has been resistant to, in some ways, and that's a bigger topic, and that's a complex topic as well. But that's been, I think, part of the discomfort for many ordinary members, let alone leaders of the church, is fitting all of this new data into older frameworks, into old bottles, and it doesn't fit. So we need new bottles for the new wine, or grape juice, and that's the process. That's where we aren't there yet. We've got good new history, better history, but the theology has to develop with it.
If you look back over history long enough, you see that there are cycles where anti-intellectualism becomes the predominant philosophy. In the church and in the country right now, that's where we are. You've seen the denigration of science, particularly during the first Trump administration, that not only caused damage, it caused a lot of deaths. Dr. Collins last night said that the Kaiser Foundation calculated that probably 230,000 people died in the United States because of the mishandling of the COVID pandemic and the dissemination of misinformation about it. We're going to see a lot more deaths because of the current anti-vax movement as well. And the whole thing is a response where the progress of science can get to a point that people are moved out of their comfort zone. And for many of them, the reaction is, I don't want to go there. And so I'm going to turn inward and deny that that's out there, and then work to destroy those who are trying to push that agenda. And boy, do you pay a heavy price for that, but that's where we are. You're seeing that within the church as well. You're seeing, again, the rise of anti-intellectualism, of the deniers of Joseph Smith as a polygamist, of the deniers of Joseph Smith as a mortal man with a lot of flaws. Yeah, big deal. Grow up.
So I guess this is a good point to end, but first we'll maybe, even though we've talked about a lot of things, I'll give you like each 2 minutes, and maybe we'll start with Patrick to sort of talk about the legacy and maybe a little bit about the future.
Sure. Well, I appreciate Greg's analogy in terms of the foundation that was laid by Leonard and that generation of Mormon historians. A lot of their books and writings are on the shelves behind me. That's I was formed as a historian by reading their work and inspired by their faith that you could combine faith and history, and that's been true in my life. But it does require an openness to complexity. It requires an openness to changing your mind, to growing, and so I think we are at a moment now where I think actually there's I can say with a fair degree of confidence, there's never been a larger group of intellectuals within the church, not just historians, but of other kinds as well, who are deeply devout and also deeply committed to their professional disciplines, whether it be history or theology or philosophy or literature or whatever it might be. So there's never been a deeper bench. But there are countervailing forces as well. Maybe that'll always be the case. But Leonard wasn't perfect. As Greg has said, he could sometimes be naive, especially in terms of the way he navigated some of the church bureaucracy. Not everything he wrote is A+ history, but he's a model and a good foundation for us to think about the ways that we can combine life of the mind and life of the spirit. And I think, and we have other examples of that from his generation, whether it be Lowell Benyon or Gene England or other kinds of people that we can talk about. But those are good foundations for us to build on as we move forward in the 21st century. We have our own issues. We have our own questions. We're going to move forward. Some of the history they wrote will be, updated by histories that we write. That's okay. That's all part of the process. But I think they provide really good models for us in terms of how not to see it as an either or, but a both and approach to both life of the mind and life of the spirit.
Thanks. Greg?
When I was working on the McKay biography, my mentor in pathology from UCLA came back and spent a month working in our lab in Maryland. He didn't have anything to do in the evenings, so he had just a very slight knowledge of Mormonism. And I said, here are the McKay diaries if you want some reading at night. So he read several hundred pages, and I said, what do you think? He said, well, if you change the proper names, this is just corporate politics. And as simple a message as that was, it really stunned me, and I realized he was absolutely right. Leonard never figured that out. He said at one point in his diaries that he thought working for the church would be the most idyllic, congenial atmosphere in the world, and boy, did he find out differently. So that's point number one of the two ending points I'll make. Point number two is very simple. It's my 3-word credo, and it is follow the data.
There you go. Well, thanks everyone for coming on the show. Maven, do you have any final comments about what you're learning about Leonard Arrington more?
No, I appreciate everybody's patience with me, and hopefully my questions were too far off base. So thank you.
So yes, this is Remembering Leonard Arrington. Thanks everyone for watching. If you like this material, like and subscribe. We're going to try to get more shows going that honor the shoulders that everyone's standing on right now in Mormon history. Have a great rest of the year. Bye-bye.
Bye.